cart tumbled down 11 marble steps before it finally stopped, spilling mop water across the lobby floor of Ashcombe Tower. Etienne Moreau stood frozen at the top of the staircase, watching the wreckage of his supply cart scatter across the polished stone. Bottles rolling, rags soaking through, the brass nameplate on his uniform catching the light from the atrium windows. Behind him, breathing hard, stood CEO Sebastian Voss, his $900 shoes still planted at the exact spot where he had shoved the cart with both hands. "You were in my way," Voss said, straightening his jacket as if nothing had happened. "Do you understand how much time I lose walking around obstacles all day?" Etienne said nothing. 61 years old, 26 of them spent inside this building, and he had never once raised his voice at a single soul who worked here. Across the lobby, 3 employees stood frozen mid-conversation. A woman near the elevators lowered her phone slowly, having already captured the entire thing. "Clean this up before the noon meeting," Voss added, not even glancing back as he turned toward the executive elevator. Etienne bent down, quietly gathering the shattered pieces of a glass cleaner bottle, saying nothing, doing what he had always done, his job. But 3 floors above, in a server room few employees even knew existed, a red light blinked steadily on a hard drive, recording every second in high definition. By nightfall, that footage would already be sitting in 7 inboxes, belonging to the one group of people Sebastian Voss feared more than anyone else in the world: the board of directors. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and if you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, please take a second to hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you more stories exactly like this. Now, let's rewind. Because to understand why that footage mattered so much, and why Sebastian Voss had no idea what he'd just done, you first need to understand who Etienne Moreau really was, and why he had been mopping these floors for 26 years in the first place. Etienne Moreau arrived at Ashcombe Tower every morning at 4:15, long before the espresso machines in the executive lounge even warmed up. He liked the quiet hours best, the hum of the building settling, the elevators resting on the ground floor, the marble atrium empty except for his cart and his own soft footsteps. He had cleaned this lobby through 3 CEOs, 2 recessions, and 1 fire that had nearly taken the East Wing in the winter of his 8th year here. To the people who worked at Ashcombe Tower, Etienne was simply Mr. Moreau, the janitor who remembered everyone's names, who kept a drawer of spare umbrellas for anyone caught in the rain, who left a small paper crane on the desk of any employee celebrating a birthday, folded from the same blue paper every single time. His daughter, Camille, worked 2 towns over as a school teacher, and every Sunday she brought her 2 children to his small house on Larkspur Lane, where he taught his grandson the same card tricks his own father had taught him back in Lyon, decades before either of them had ever set foot in America. "Grandpa," his granddaughter Margot asked him once, tracing a finger along the edge of an old photograph on his mantel, "why do you keep this old picture in a suit? You never wear suits?" Etienne only smiled. "That was a long time ago, sweetheart. A different life." He never elaborated. Camille had asked the same question 100 times over the years, and every time her father simply changed the subject, pouring more coffee, asking about her students instead. Because the photograph on that mantel wasn't just an old picture. It was Etienne Moreau, 34 years old, standing beside 2 other men in front of a modest storefront that would one day become Ashcombe Industries, the very tower he now cleaned every morning at 4:15. He had built this company from nothing. He had arrived in America at 19 with little more than a suitcase and a set of tools he'd learned to use working alongside his father in a small machine shop outside Lyon. He'd taken night classes in business while working double shifts at a hardware store, saving every spare dollar toward a dream he barely dared say out loud. When he finally partnered with a woman named Eleanor Castellano and a man named Robert Voss to found what would become Ashcombe Industries, he was 34 years old, married only a year, with a newborn daughter waiting at home each night, when he finally locked up their small rented storefront. Those early years had been brutal. 18-hour days, a payroll that sometimes barely cleared, nights spent arguing with his two partners about which principles mattered more than short-term profit. Etienne had always argued for the workers. Robert had always argued for the numbers. Eleanor, more often than not, had found herself caught somewhere between the two, though she leaned quietly toward Etienne's instincts more often than she ever admitted aloud at the time. By the time Ashcombe had grown into a company worth hundreds of millions, Etienne had already begun to feel the cost of his own success. The long hours that had stolen years from his marriage, the missed recitals and soccer games that Camille still occasionally mentioned with a gentle, forgiving ache in her voice. When his wife's health began declining in his mid-50s, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He sold the majority of his shares, secured a single unusual clause in the buyout agreement, and quietly stepped away from the company that bore the fingerprints of everything he'd sacrificed to build. He never regretted it. Not once. But he never stopped wondering either whether the culture he and his partners had built together would survive without him watching over it. And he had walked away from its daily operations decades ago, for reasons only 3 people in the world still understood. Now, that quiet life he'd chosen was about to collide, violently, with the ambitions of a man who had no idea whose company he actually thought he owned. Sebastian Voss had been CEO of Ashcombe Industries for 6 years, and in that time, he had transformed the company's stock price, its headlines, and its culture, though not all in the direction people assumed. He was brilliant, in the narrow sense that mattered to shareholders. Revenue was up, margins were up, but turnover among mid-level staff had tripled, and 3 separate HR investigations into his conduct had quietly closed without consequence, buried under non-disclosure agreements and generous severance checks. Voss believed deeply and sincerely that fear was simply an efficient management tool. He arrived at 7 each morning in a car worth more than most employees' annual salaries, walked briskly through the lobby without acknowledging a single person by name, and expected the building itself to part for him like water around a stone. "People don't respect kindness," he told his assistant, Gregory Finch, over lunch one afternoon. "They respect results, and results require discipline. Discomfort builds discipline." Gregory, who had learned years ago never to disagree with Sebastian directly, simply nodded and changed the subject. Voss had inherited his confidence early, a private education, a family name that opened doors before he'd even walked through them, and a belief, quietly instilled by his own father, that authority was simply a matter of posture and volume. He had never once, in 6 years, learned the names of the maintenance staff, the security guards, or the janitorial team that kept his glass tower running. To him, they were simply part of the building's infrastructure, as invisible and unremarkable as the wiring behind the walls. His father, Robert Voss, had co-founded Ashcombe alongside Etienne Moreau and Eleanor Castellano decades earlier, but Sebastian had grown up seeing only the company's later success: the private jets, the acquisition headlines, the magazine profiles calling his father a visionary. He had never once heard the stories of those brutal early years, the ones where his father and Etienne had slept on cots in the back office to save on rent, or the ones where Etienne had personally driven a delivery truck through a snowstorm because no one else would risk it. Robert, in his later years, had grown quieter about those memories, and Sebastian had simply assumed the company had always existed the way he found it. polished, powerful, and inevitable. By the time Sebastian took over as CEO, he had convinced himself that his father's early partners were relics of a bygone era, unnecessary now that Ashcombe operated with modern efficiency and Wall Street sophistication. He rarely asked questions about the company's founding beyond what appeared in official investor materials, and he certainly never wondered what had become of the two people whose names sat beside his father's on that old cornerstone plaque he passed every single morning without a glance. That Tuesday morning, rushing toward an emergency call with an activist investor, threatening to challenge his leadership at the next shareholder meeting, Sebastian Voss saw an obstacle in his path. He didn't see a person. He saw a supply cart, an old man moving slower than his schedule allowed, and 11 marble steps standing between him and the elevator bank. He was about to learn, in the most public way imaginable, exactly whose company he had been running all along. "Move that cart," Voss snapped, striding toward the staircase, phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp enough to cut through the morning quiet of the lobby. Etienne, halfway up the marble steps with his cart, glanced up. "Of course, sir. Just one moment." "I don't have a moment," Voss said, ending his call abruptly and shoving the phone into his pocket. "I have an investor call in 6 minutes, and you're blocking my path." "I'll clear the way right now," Etienne said calmly, beginning to angle the cart toward the railing. But Voss, impatient, reached out and grabbed the edge of the cart himself, shoving it hard to force it aside. The wheels caught on the lip of the top step. The cart tipped, tumbled, and crashed down all 11 steps in a cascade of shattering glass and spilled cleaning solution, the sound echoing across the entire lobby. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a woman near the elevator bank, Nadia Kowalczyk, a junior analyst who had started at Ashcombe only 4 months earlier, slowly lowered the phone she'd been holding, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and disbelief. "Sir," Etienne said quietly, steadying himself against the railing, "that wasn't necessary." "You were in my way," Voss repeated, straightening his jacket, glancing at his watch as though the entire incident had cost him 30 seconds he desperately needed back. "Do you understand how much time I lose walking around obstacles all day?" Around them, 3 more employees had gathered, whispering, phones rising discreetly. Etienne bent down slowly, gathering the shattered glass with steady, practiced hands, saying nothing further. Voss, satisfied the obstacle had been cleared, turned toward the executive elevator without a single glance backward. "Clean this up before the noon meeting," he added over his shoulder. What Sebastian Voss did not know, could not have known, was that the security office on the 3rd floor had recently installed a new camera system specifically to monitor high-traffic public areas, following an unrelated liability concern the previous year. Every second of what had just happened was already saved in crystal-clear resolution, and the head of building security, a quiet man named Marcus Whitfield, who had worked at Ashcombe for nearly as long as Etienne himself, was about to make a decision that would change everything. Nadia Kowalczyk stood frozen near the elevator bank for a long moment after Voss disappeared upstairs, her heart still hammering from what she'd just witnessed. She glanced around at the small cluster of co-workers who had gathered, all of them exchanging the same uneasy look. The look of people who had just watched something wrong happen, and weren't yet sure what, if anything, they were supposed to do about it. "Someone should help him," she finally said, more to herself than anyone else, crossing the lobby toward the scattered glass. "Ms. Kowalczyk, please, I can manage," Etienne said gently, waving her back. "You'll ruin your shoes." "I don't care about my shoes," she said, kneeling anyway, carefully gathering shards of broken glass into a dustpan she'd grabbed from his overturned cart. "That was completely unacceptable. Someone needs to report this." "Reports have a way of disappearing in buildings like this one," Etienne said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact he'd learned to accept over many years. "But I appreciate the thought." Nadia frowned, unsatisfied, but said nothing further as the two of them worked together in silence, restoring the lobby to its usual gleaming order within 20 minutes, as though nothing unusual had ever happened at all. She kept the video on her phone, though. She wasn't entirely sure why yet. She only knew, somewhere in her gut, that it might matter later. By early afternoon, the video clip, 22 seconds long, shot from Nadia Kowalczyk's phone, had already circulated through 3 different group chats inside the company. Word moved quickly through Ashcombe Tower, the way it always does in large buildings full of people who feel small and unheard. Whispers in the break room, sideways glances near the coffee station, a junior manager quietly forwarding the clip to a friend in HR, just so someone official sees this. But nothing happened. By 4 o'clock, HR Director Isabelle Laurent had received 3 separate emails referencing the incident. She reviewed the shaky phone video twice, sighed, and drafted a message to her supervisor. The supervisor, aware that Isabelle answered directly to Voss's office for budget approval, quietly suggested she let this one cool down before escalating. Meanwhile, Etienne returned to his usual rounds that afternoon, his shoulder faintly bruised from catching himself on the railing, his supply cart replaced with a spare from the storage closet. He said nothing to anyone about what had happened. He simply worked, the way he always had. "You okay, Mr. Moreau?" Nadia asked quietly, catching him near the elevator bank later that day. "I saw what happened this morning. That was completely uncalled for." Etienne offered a small, tired smile. "I've weathered worse mornings, Miss Kowalczyk, but thank you for asking. Are you going to report it?" "Reports have a way of disappearing around men like Mr. Voss," Etienne said simply, wheeling his cart toward the next hallway. "I've seen it happen before." Nadia frowned, unsatisfied with that answer, but said nothing further. What neither of them knew was that Marcus Whitfield, alone in the security office 3 floors above, had already reviewed the high-definition footage twice. He had also, quietly, cross-referenced something else. A name buried deep in the building's original architectural blueprints. A name etched into a small brass plaque near the building's cornerstone that most employees walked past every day without ever reading. Founded 1994, E. Moreau, A. Castellano, R. Voss. Marcus stared at that final surname for a long moment, his stomach tightening. Because Sebastian Voss's own father, decades ago, had been one of Ashcombe's 3 founding partners, and Etienne Moreau, the janitor whose cart had just been thrown down 11 marble steps, had been the very first name on that plaque. That evening, long after most of the building had emptied out, Marcus Whitfield sat alone in his small security office, scrolling back through weeks of archived footage he had never before had reason to review. What he found unsettled him more than the incident on the stairs. 3 weeks earlier, a contractor named David Ferris had been publicly berated by Voss in the loading dock for arriving 4 minutes late, loud enough that 2 other workers had stopped what they were doing simply to watch. 2 months before that, a maintenance technician named Rachel Ellsworth had been threatened with termination after asking Voss to wait while she finished securing a ladder, an incident that ended with her filing a complaint that mysteriously vanished from HR's system within 48 hours. None of it had ever reached the board. Every complaint, every uncomfortable interaction had been quietly absorbed by a company culture that had learned, over 6 years, to simply look away. Marcus printed each clip's timestamp, added it to a growing folder on his desk, and sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He thought about his own daughter, 23 years old, working her first job at a downtown accounting firm, and how he'd taught her since childhood to speak up when something felt wrong. He thought about how easy it would be to justify staying silent tonight, how simple it would be to let tomorrow's meeting handle everything through the usual channels, the ones that had failed people like Rachel and David for years. He closed the folder, locked his office, and drove home in silence. the weight of his decision already settling over him long before he opened his laptop past midnight. The next morning, before the incident had fully spread through the building's rumor mill, Etienne found himself unexpectedly summoned to Isabelle Laurent's office on the 4th floor. "Mr. Moreau," Isabelle said carefully, gesturing for him to sit, "I wanted to speak with you directly about yesterday's incident. I understand this must have been distressing." Etienne lowered himself into the chair across from her desk, folding his hands calmly in his lap. "It was unpleasant, yes, but I've had worse days in this building, Ms. Laurent." Isabelle hesitated, glancing briefly toward her closed office door. "Off the record, I want you to know I did try to escalate this yesterday afternoon. I was told to let it, in their words, cool down first. I imagine that's happened before," Etienne said gently. "To others, not just to me." Isabelle's expression flickered with something like guilt. "More than I'd like to admit. I've documented 7 incidents myself over the past 2 years alone. Every single one closed without real consequence." "Then, perhaps," Etienne said, rising slowly from his chair, "it's time someone outside this building's usual channels took a closer look." Isabelle frowned, unsure exactly what he meant, watching him leave her office with far more composure than she felt any ordinary janitor should possess after being publicly humiliated the day before. She didn't yet know how right her instincts were. Marcus Whitfield didn't sleep well that night. He sat at his kitchen table well past midnight, the security footage paused on his laptop screen, staring at the frozen image of Sebastian Voss's hand gripping the edge of that cart. He knew company protocol. Incidents involving executive conduct were supposed to route through HR first, then legal, then, only in extreme cases, directly to the board. But he also knew, from 22 years working inside Ashcombe Tower, exactly how often that protocol quietly failed the people it was supposed to protect. He thought about his own father, a mill worker in Ohio, who had once been fired for speaking up about unsafe machinery, with no one above him willing to listen. He thought about Etienne Moreau, sweeping these same floors for over 2 decades without a single complaint, without a single raised voice, treated that morning like an obstacle instead of a person. And he thought about that brass plaque by the cornerstone and the question it raised that he couldn't quite shake. Just after 1 in the morning, Marcus made his decision. He didn't send the footage to HR. He didn't send it to legal. He compiled the 22-second clip alongside his own written incident report, encrypted the file, and sent it directly to 7 personal email addresses belonging to Ashcombe's board of directors, bypassing every internal channel that had failed similar complaints before. In his message, he wrote only 1 line beyond the factual summary of the incident. "I believe several of you may recognize the janitor in this footage better than you realize." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Because if his research was correct, if Etienne Moreau truly was the same E. Moreau listed on that cornerstone plaque, then several members of that board were about to receive the shock of their professional lives. And Sebastian Voss, sound asleep in his penthouse across town, had no idea that a storm was already gathering above him. One he had triggered himself, 11 marble steps at a time. The next morning began deceptively normal. Sebastian Voss arrived at 7, as always, striding through the lobby without a glance toward the freshly cleaned staircase, entirely unaware that his assistant, Gregory Finch, had already fielded 4 unusual phone calls before 8 a.m., all from board members requesting an urgent closed-door session that afternoon. "Did something happen?" Voss asked, only mildly curious, adjusting his cufflinks in his office mirror. "They didn't say, sir," Gregory replied carefully. "Just that it was time-sensitive." Voss dismissed it as nothing more than routine investor anxiety, the same activist pressure he'd been managing for weeks. He spent the morning preparing talking points about quarterly growth, confident that whatever concern the board had, his numbers would silence it. the same way they always had. Meanwhile, on the ground floor, Etienne continued his rounds as though nothing unusual had happened, unaware that his old identity, buried for decades beneath a mop and a modest uniform, was quietly resurfacing in inboxes above him. At noon, board chair Eleanor Castellano arrived at Ashcombe Tower personally, something she rarely did outside of scheduled quarterly meetings. She walked through the lobby slowly, her eyes lingering on the staircase, then on the janitor quietly restocking his cart near the far wall. She recognized him instantly. 26 years had changed his hairline, added lines around his eyes, softened his posture with age. But she recognized the same steady calm she remembered from decades earlier, back when the three of them had built this company from a single rented storefront with nothing but ambition and borrowed money. "Etienne," she said softly, approaching him near the supply closet. "It's been a long time." Etienne turned, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, followed quickly by quiet resignation. "Eleanor," he said simply. "I wondered how long it would take." "You've been here the entire time? Working as—" She gestured vaguely toward his cart, unable to finish the sentence. "I asked for anonymity a long time ago," Etienne said. "I kept my seat. I kept my voice when it mattered. But I never wanted my name attached to headlines again. Not after everything that happened with the buyout." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Sebastian doesn't know, does he? He has no idea who you actually are." "No," Etienne said quietly. "And I'd like to keep it that way a little longer if you don't mind." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The board meets at 3. Whatever happens today, Etienne, this ends the way it should have ended a long time ago." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry it took a security camera to finally bring me back through that door." Etienne only offered a small, tired smile, returning to his cart as though the conversation had never happened. That afternoon, unaware that his own downfall was already being quietly arranged 3 floors above him, Sebastian Voss called an all-staff email blast addressing what he described as an unfortunate lobby incident that has been blown out of proportion by a handful of overly sensitive employees. The email, sent to all 412 Ashcombe employees, urged staff to focus on the company's remarkable quarterly performance rather than minor workplace friction. Nadia Kowalczyk read the email twice at her desk, her jaw tightening with each sentence. She forwarded it silently to Isabelle Laurent, adding no commentary of her own, though the message hardly needed any. Isabelle, reading it in her office, felt something shift inside her, a familiar frustration finally curdling into resolve. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus Whitfield's extension. "I saw the email," Marcus said before she could speak. "I want to help," Isabelle said quietly. "Whatever you're planning to do with what you found, I want to help you build the case properly, documented, undeniable." There was a brief pause on the line. "I already sent everything to the board last night," Marcus admitted. Isabelle exhaled sharply. "Good. Then let's make sure whatever happens next actually sticks this time." Over the next several hours, the two of them worked quietly together, cross-referencing Isabelle's buried HR complaints against Marcus's security footage archives, building a timeline that stretched back nearly 4 years, long before either of them had fully understood the pattern hiding in plain sight. By the time Eleanor Castellano arrived at the tower the following day, she wasn't just carrying Marcus's original footage and the founding charter. She was carrying an entire case file, thick with names, dates, and evidence that Sebastian Voss's conduct had never been an isolated lapse in judgment. It had been a pattern hiding in plain sight for years. That evening, Etienne sat across from Camille at his small kitchen table, the same photograph from the mantel now resting between them, finally pulled down after decades of gathering dust. "Dad," Camille said carefully. "Eleanor Castellano came to see you today, at work. Someone from HR mentioned it to a friend of mine." Etienne sighed, running a thumb along the edge of the old photograph. "I suppose it's time you finally understood some things." "Understood what things?" "This company," he said quietly, tapping the photograph. "Your grandmother's medical bills, this house, your education, all of it came from a company I helped build with my own 2 hands, back when I was younger than you are now." Camille's eyes widened. "Ashcombe? You mean you actually founded Ashcombe Industries?" "Alongside 2 friends," Etienne said. "Eleanor Castellano and a man named Robert Voss." Camille's breath caught. "Voss, as in Sebastian's father," Etienne confirmed. "Robert was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced that kindness was a weakness in business. We disagreed on almost everything except the product itself. When I sold most of my shares 15 years ago, I kept one condition in the company charter: a lifetime advisory seat, kept anonymous, specifically so I could keep watching how this company treated the people at the bottom, long after I stopped sitting at the top. Why keep it a secret? Why work as a janitor of all things?" Etienne's eyes softened. "Because titles change how people treat you, Camille. I wanted to see this company honestly, the way an ordinary worker sees it, not the polished version executives present in boardrooms. I wanted to know if we'd built something good, or something that simply looked good from a distance. And now?" Etienne was quiet for a long moment. "Now, I finally have my answer. And tomorrow, so will everyone else." Camille sat back in her chair, studying her father as though seeing him for the first time. Not as the quiet, gentle man who taught card tricks and folded paper cranes, but as someone who had carried an entire hidden history inside him for as long as she'd been alive. "All those years," she said softly, "watching you come home smelling like floor cleaner, worrying that people treated you like you were invisible. You could have stopped it any time you wanted." "I could have," Etienne admitted. "But then I would have only ever seen the version of this company people perform for someone with power. I wanted to see the truth. I wanted to know whether the values your grandmother and I sacrificed so much for still meant something, or whether they'd quietly died the moment I stopped watching." "And your answer hurt you," Camille said gently, noticing the way he still favored his bruised shoulder. "It did," he admitted. "But it also gave me the exact proof I needed to fix it properly, instead of simply guessing from a distance." Later that night, after Camille had gone home, Etienne sat alone on his porch, looking out at the quiet street, turning the old photograph over in his hands. He thought about Robert Voss, the friend and rival who had shaped so much of his early adulthood, and wondered, not for the first time, what had gone wrong between the principles Robert once claimed to believe in and the son he had ultimately raised. He thought, too, about his late wife, who had always told him that patience was not the same thing as weakness, that sometimes the quietest people in the room were simply waiting for the moment when their voice would finally matter most. Tomorrow, he suspected, that moment had finally arrived. Camille reached across the table, gripping her father's weathered hand. "You could have told me sooner. I didn't want you carrying this weight," he said gently. "I wanted you to have an ordinary father, not a headline." Camille squeezed his hand tighter. "You've always been more than ordinary, Dad. You just never let anyone see it." The board convened at exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon. 7 directors seated around a long mahogany table on the top floor of Ashcombe Tower, the same floor Sebastian Voss had never once needed to share with anyone he considered beneath him. Marcus Whitfield's footage played in silence on the projection screen, 22 seconds looping twice before Eleanor Castellano finally spoke. "This incident occurred yesterday morning in our own lobby, witnessed by at least 4 employees," she said. The man in this footage has worked at Ashcombe for 26 years. Director Nathaniel Ashgrove, a longtime board member, frowned. This is a serious HR matter, certainly. But why an emergency board session over a single altercation with janitorial staff? Eleanor placed a single sheet of paper on the table. A copy of Ashcombe's original founding charter, complete with 3 signatures at the bottom. Because the janitorial staff member in question, she said quietly, is Etienne Moreau. Silence spread across the table. Nathaniel leaned forward, squinting at the signatures. The Moreau? The original E. Moreau? The very same, Eleanor confirmed. He's held an anonymous lifetime advisory seat on this board since the day he sold his controlling shares. Per the exact charter clause several of you approved without ever meeting him personally. Another director, younger, newer to the company, shook his head in disbelief. You're telling us our CEO just threw a founding partner's cart down a staircase? I'm telling you our CEO assaulted, whether he realized it or not. The very man whose vision built the foundation this entire company still stands on, Eleanor said. And he did it without a single ounce of curiosity about who that man actually was. Gregory Finch, summoned reluctantly to provide context on Voss's schedule that morning, sat pale and silent near the door, slowly realizing the magnitude of what his boss had unleashed. There's more, Marcus Whitfield added quietly, having been invited into the meeting specifically for this moment. He placed a second folder on the table. This isn't an isolated incident. I compiled 17 additional complaints filed against Mr. Voss over the past 4 years, reports on aggressive conduct toward junior staff, contractors, and maintenance workers. Every single one was closed without consequence, buried under NDAs signed as a condition of severance. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she scanned the folder. 17! At minimum, Marcus said. I imagine there are more we simply never heard about. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, the weight of years of quiet complicity finally settling over the table. We need to speak with him directly, Nathaniel said finally, and we need to speak with Etienne. Eleanor nodded slowly. Both, today. Because tomorrow, this footage reaches far beyond this boardroom, whether we act or not. Before summoning either man, the board spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing Isabel and Marcus's combined case file in uncomfortable silence. Director Ashgrove read through the timeline of buried complaints twice, his frown deepening with each page. Rachel Ellsworth. I remember approving her severance package personally. I was told she resigned voluntarily. She didn't resign, Isabel said quietly, having been invited into the room specifically to answer exactly these questions. She was pressured into signing an NDA after Mr. Voss threatened her position over a workplace safety disagreement. I have the original complaint, time-stamped, before it was quietly removed from our system 3 days later. A younger director, visibly shaken, turned to Eleanor. How long has this board been rubber-stamping severance packages without asking basic questions? Too long, Eleanor admitted, her voice heavy. We trusted our numbers. We should have been asking about our people. Nathaniel closed the folder slowly, exhaling. This isn't just about one man's temper anymore. This is about a system, and every one of us sitting at this table let it continue. Then let's make sure whatever we decide today doesn't just remove Sebastian, Eleanor said firmly. Let's make sure it actually rebuilds what he spent 6 years tearing down. Marcus, still standing near the door, spoke up one final time. There's one more thing the board should know before this conversation continues. Every head turned toward him. The founding charter Eleanor showed you earlier, he said. I didn't just confirm the signatures matched historical records. I found the original clause granting Mr. Moreau's advisory seat, buried in an appendix nobody has referenced in over a decade. It grants him standing authority to call an emergency board vote on any matter involving executive conduct. A right none of you may have realized still existed. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. He never once exercised it. Not until now, Marcus said quietly. I believe that's precisely why he's finally ready to walk back through that door. Sebastian Voss walked into the boardroom at 4 o'clock, still entirely unaware of what awaited him. His confidence intact, his talking points about quarterly earnings tucked neatly under one arm. I understand there's some urgency, he said, taking his usual seat at the head of the table. I assume this concerns the activist investor situation. It concerns yesterday morning, Eleanor said simply, nodding toward the projection screen. The footage played. Voss watched himself grip the edge of the cart, watched it tumble down 11 marble steps, watched himself walk away without a backward glance. That was an unfortunate accident, Voss said carefully, straightening in his chair. The man was blocking my path. I apologize if the optics are unflattering, but I hardly think— His name is Etienne Moreau, Eleanor interrupted. Voss blinked. The janitor? Yes, I'm aware he's on staff. What of it? Eleanor slid the founding charter across the table. Voss stared at the 3 signatures. His face slowly drained of color as recognition dawned. That's not possible, he stammered. The Moreau from the charter retired decades ago. Everyone knows that. He didn't retire, Eleanor said quietly. He stepped back from daily operations and requested anonymity, keeping a lifetime advisory seat that several board members, myself included, have honored for 15 years. He's spent every single one of those years working this building's floors, watching exactly how this company treats the people your father once promised to value above all else. Voss's mouth opened, then closed, no words emerging. Your own father's signature is on this document, Sebastian, Eleanor continued. Robert Voss stood beside Etienne Moreau the day this company was founded. And yesterday, without knowing it, you assaulted the very man who made your entire career possible. The door opened quietly, and Etienne stepped inside, no longer wearing his janitorial uniform, dressed instead in a simple gray suit that fit him exactly as it had in that old photograph on his mantel. Sebastian Voss stared at him, the color completely gone from his face. Mr. Moreau, Voss whispered. You can call me Etienne, he said calmly, taking a seat at the far end of the table. You've certainly earned the familiarity, given everything you've thrown at me this week. Voss's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Why didn't you ever say something? All these years, walking these halls, watching me, why stay silent? Because silence taught me more than confrontation ever could, Etienne said. If I'd walked in here 15 years ago demanding accountability, you would have performed decency for exactly as long as I was watching, and reverted the moment I left the room. I needed to see what this company actually was, not what it pretended to be for the benefit of its founders. And what did you see? Voss asked, his voice quieter now, some of the arrogance finally drained out of it. I saw a company that forgot the very people who built it from nothing, Etienne said. I saw complaints buried, contractors humiliated, and a young man so convinced that fear equaled respect that he never once stopped to ask whether the people around him actually believed in what they were building or simply feared what would happen if they didn't comply. Voss lowered his eyes, silent for a long moment. My father built this company on people like you. I always thought I was building on his legacy. You were building on his name, Etienne said, not unkindly. Legacy requires understanding the values behind the name. That's the part, I'm afraid, you never inherited. The room, for the first time in Sebastian Voss's entire career, watched him with something other than deference. They watched him with judgment. I want to be clear about something, Etienne said, addressing the table calmly, his voice carrying the same steady authority it once had decades earlier, when he'd negotiated the company's very first supplier contracts. I didn't come back into this room seeking revenge. I came back because I finally have enough evidence to answer a question I've been asking myself for 15 years. He turned toward Sebastian. Is this company still worth the sacrifices your father and I made to build it? Yesterday morning, you gave me my answer. Voss's composure finally cracked. I didn't know who you were. If I had known, that's precisely the problem, Etienne said firmly. You shouldn't need to know someone's founding shares, their net worth, or their surname to treat them with basic decency. You threw my cart down those stairs believing I was simply an obstacle, a person unworthy of 30 seconds of patience. That belief, Sebastian, not my identity, is the real issue this board needs to address. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the table. The board has reviewed the totality of evidence, including 17 prior complaints buried under NDAs during your tenure. Effective immediately, Sebastian Voss, your position as Chief Executive Officer of Ashcombe Industries is terminated for cause, citing repeated violations of our Code of Conduct and abuse of executive authority. Voss shot to his feet. You can't be serious. My leadership doubled this company's valuation at the cost of a culture your own father would be ashamed of, Etienne said quietly. Robert Voss built this company on a simple principle, that every person inside these walls, from the boardroom to the loading dock, deserved to be treated as an equal contributor to something larger than themselves. You inherited his name, Sebastian. You never earned his values. Security, led personally by Marcus Whitfield, escorted a stunned Sebastian Voss from the building less than an hour later, his executive keycard deactivated before he even reached the lobby. As they crossed the same marble staircase where the entire ordeal had begun, Voss paused, staring down at the 11 steps below him. A cleaning crew had already replaced the shattered glass and restored the marble to its usual polish, leaving no visible trace of what had happened there days earlier. I built half of what this company became, Voss said quietly, almost to himself. Doesn't that count for something? Marcus, walking a respectful pace beside him, considered the question carefully before answering. It might have, Mr. Voss, if you'd built it alongside the people who made it possible, instead of on top of them. Voss said nothing further, descending the staircase in silence, his footsteps echoing across the same lobby where an old man's supply cart had once tumbled down ahead of him. In the weeks following Sebastian Voss's removal, the full scope of the case file Marcus and Isabel had assembled became public record through a mandatory shareholder disclosure. Rachel Ellsworth, the maintenance technician pressured into resigning 2 years earlier, received a formal reinstatement offer along with back pay covering the entire period since her departure. She accepted, tearfully, in a meeting with Isabel that ended with both women embracing outside the HR office. David Ferris, the contractor humiliated on the loading dock, was invited to submit a formal statement as part of the company's new accountability review, a process Eleanor personally committed to overseeing for no less than 2 years. Sebastian Voss, for his part, retreated from public life almost entirely, issuing a brief statement through his attorney expressing regret for any misunderstanding, language that satisfied almost no one who had watched the security footage circulate publicly. His father, Robert Voss, long retired and living quietly outside the city, reportedly reached out to Etienne directly in the days following the board's decision. The contents of that conversation were never made public, though Eleanor later mentioned, in passing, that Robert had simply said, "I always worried I taught him the wrong half of what mattered." Nadia Kowalczyk found herself unexpectedly interviewed by 2 separate business journals covering the incident. Her 22-second video cited repeatedly as the spark that exposed a far larger pattern of neglect. She accepted the attention with visible discomfort, insisting in every interview that the real credit belonged to The people who'd been trying to raise these concerns for years before I happened to be standing in the right place with my phone. For Isabelle Laurent, the company's new employee advocacy office became more than a promotion. It became a mission. Within its first month, she implemented a direct, anonymous reporting channel rooted outside executive oversight entirely, ensuring no future complaint could quietly vanish the way so many had before. And through it all, Etienne Moreau remained remarkably unchanged. Still arriving early, still remembering names, still folding the occasional blue paper crane for an employee's birthday, though now from behind a modest office door instead of a supply closet. 3 weeks later, Ashcombe Tower's lobby looked much the same as it always had. Marble floors gleaming, morning light spilling through the atrium windows, employees hurrying toward elevators with coffee cups in hand. But something had shifted. Etienne Moreau no longer pushed a supply cart through these halls. Instead, he now split his time between his advisory seat on the board and a newly created mentorship program for building staff, one designed to ensure every employee, regardless of title, had a direct channel to leadership that could never again be silenced. Eleanor Castellano had stepped in as interim CEO, publicly committing to restoring the company culture both she and Etienne had originally envisioned decades earlier. Marcus Whitfield received a formal commendation from the board for his courage in bypassing a broken system to ensure the truth reached the people capable of acting on it. Nadia Kowalczyk, promoted into a newly formed employee advocacy office, often stopped by Etienne's new office for coffee. Still slightly in awe of the quiet man she'd once known only as the janitor with a kind smile. "I still can't believe it," she admitted one afternoon. "All those years, and nobody knew." "Some truths need time before they're ready to be seen," Etienne said, smiling faintly. "Yours found the courage to record what needed recording. Mine simply needed the right moment to step back into the light." Isabelle Laurent's new employee advocacy office had already fielded over 60 confidential reports in its first month alone, a number that horrified the board when they first reviewed it, and then quietly reassured them once they realized how many of those reports were finally being resolved fairly, instead of vanishing into silence the way they once had. Rachel Ellsworth, back at work after her reinstatement, made a point of stopping by the lobby every Friday afternoon, coffee in hand, simply to say hello to Etienne on her way out. "You gave people like me a reason to believe this place could still be fixed," she told him once. "I just wanted you to know that." David Ferris, the contractor once humiliated on the loading dock, returned to complete a project he'd originally abandoned out of frustration, this time working under a supervisor personally selected by Eleanor to ensure no contractor would ever again be treated the way he had been. Even Gregory Finch, Sebastian's former assistant, found himself unexpectedly retained under the new leadership, given a chance to prove that his years of quiet compliance had been born from fear rather than character. He took the opportunity seriously, becoming one of the loudest internal advocates for the very reforms he'd once watched fail to materialize under his old boss. Camille visited often now, bringing Margot and her younger brother to see the lobby their grandfather had once quietly protected for over 2 decades. Margot, staring up at the newly installed plaque near the staircase, the same 11 marble steps where everything had begun, traced her fingers over the engraved words. "Kindness is not weakness. It is the foundation this company was built upon." "Grandpa," she said softly, "is this because of what happened to you?" Etienne knelt beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's because of what almost happened to everyone who works here, sweetheart." Before someone finally noticed, for the first time in 15 years, Etienne Moreau walked through the lobby of Ashcombe Tower not as an anonymous observer, but as exactly who he had always been, the quiet foundation an entire company had been built upon, finally recognized in the light of day. "So tell me, Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments below. I truly do read as many as I can, and I'd love to know. What was your favorite moment in this story? Was it the reveal in the boardroom? Or that quiet final scene by the staircase? Would you have kept your identity secret for 15 years, the way Etienne did, just to see the truth for yourself? If this story moved you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes patience and integrity eventually win. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.